Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Two Cities podcast. Today, I'm going to do something a little bit different from previous content, previous interviews and discussions, and provide a presentation that I've been working on and offer some historical analysis on the crisis in the church that we're living through. And I'm going to begin with the Ralliement of Leo XIII and examine some of the background that it offers to the crisis in the church. Jacques Plancard de Sac quoted Louis Villeux, the famous French 19th century counter-revolutionary journalist, who said, quote, "Two powers are alive and at war in the world, revelation and revolution." Now, all is summed up in this preliminary observation. Either man received from God what de Bonald used to call the essential constitution of mankind, and the Decalogue ought to be the rule for society, or man did not receive any divine law and devises his own law. Now, doubtless we can date the long march of liberalism back to the esoteric sects of the 15th century and the Freemasonry of the 17th century, as well as to the so-called Renaissance and to Protestantism. But the battle for liberal Catholicism itself really was to rage from the French Revolution until Vatican II, when apparently it eventually triumphed. In many ways, the story of the crisis in the church begins with the rise of liberal Catholicism after the French Revolution. Bishop Williamson wrote, quote, "Many Catholics have understood that the Second Vatican Council has been a disaster. Fewer seem to have understood that the council did not happen overnight. Many still seem to believe that the Church was rather well governed on the whole until 1958. For the sake of the future, it does not behoove to stretch Noah's mantle too far. According to good logic, the diabolical disorientation, of which Sister Lucia of Fatima spoke, must have affected more than one pope before Vatican II. And to say so is in no way undermining papal authority. On the contrary, it is supporting it by forcing people to make a distinction between the truth of the church and the errors of churchmen." End quote. So in this series, I hope to trace the spirit of compromise which grew in the church in the 19th century and was paralleled by an infiltration of the church by the enemies of the church. Now, I'm going to begin this examination of the crisis in the church with the Ralliement, because what began as a purely diplomatic move desired by Pope Leo XIII, rather tempted to strike a slight alliance with the world, as Archbishop Lefebvre called it, this Ralliement progressively became more doctrinal because, quote, "it indentured on principle Catholicism to a particular form of government, while at the same time reforming of the laity's vocation, which gradually in the last years of the 19th century into the 20th century passed from the temporal field to social apostolate in the spiritual field under the guidance of the clergy. The widely spread opinion that the best form of government was democracy and no longer monarchy corroborated the doctrinal change, the apparent doctrinal change. Democracy supposedly protected citizens' rights, and the church's validation of democracy grew to such an extent that it seemed, quote, to be a postulate of nature imposed by reason itself, as Pope Pius XII declared in 1944. And we might say that in its ultimate form, the Ralliement of Pope Leo XIII received its theological final approval at the Second Vatican Council, that the Second Vatican Council was, in a certain sense, the theological Ralliement. So to start with, it is important to establish the historical context, to trace this spirit of compromise and identify why it was so powerful in France. It's probably first applied by the so-called constitutional priests, some of whom at least certainly took the 1792 Oath of Liberty and Equality in the hope of safeguarding their ministry. Pope Pius VI at the time eventually condemned the oath, as well as the civil constitution of the clergy, and ordered priests to retract their oath. This mindset, however, was to last, since Chateaubriand declared in his Apology for the Faith, the Genius of Christianity in 1802, quote, "It spread the conviction that truth is brought about by public discussion, that freedom always enlightens public opinion, and that neither the truth nor the church need temporal protection." End quote. Even after the restoration of what was supposed to be the most Christian French monarchy, the 1814 Charter of Louis XVIII granted freedom of worship to all religions. It made that concession to the French Revolution. And Pius VII protested against this in an open letter to the Bishop of Boulogne, dated 29th of April of the same year, but to no effect. So we have the growth of liberal Catholicism. And the true father of liberal Catholicism was, like Chateaubriand, a romanticist from Brittany, Father Félicité de Lamennais, who in 1830 founded the daily newspaper L'Avenir, The Future, with the support of Father Henri Lacordaire and of Charles de Montalembert. This group of liberal Catholics congregated around L'Avenir. Father de Lamennais advocated the sovereignty of the people as the utmost expression of Christianity, vox populi, vox Dei. Eventually his views were condemned in 1832 by Gregory XVI in his encyclical Mirare Vos, and de Lamennais eventually apostatized, whereas his companions carried on the struggle from within. And they were soon joined by a bishop here, Bishop Dupanloup of Orléans, and Father Marat, who founded in 1848 another daily, L'Ère Nouvelle, the New Era. Lacordaire and later Frederick Ozanam, among others, signed its manifesto. And from this point onwards, a real and organized liberal Catholic party would act, with the basic program to prevent the Holy See from working directly against the revolution and to bring about a reconciliation between the two. Now, Catholic liberalism, of course, as we're all too familiar, is somewhat difficult to define, or makes itself difficult to define. We can begin with, in 1856, Albert de Broglie, who was the French premier from 1873 to 77, concluded, quote, "Instead of choosing between the principles of 1789, the French Revolution, and the dogmas of the Catholic religion, let us purify the principles with the dogmas, and we will have them walk hand in hand," end quote. As Arnaud de la Suze says, Catholic liberalism is therefore, first of all, a mindset, a mentality, characterized by a romantical exaltation of liberty and an overbearing leaning towards conciliation. This eagerness to conciliate with the modern world and to downplay the malevolence of the enemies of the church. The liberal Catholic doctrine, which therefore assimilates the revolutionary doctrine of 1789, sets in principle the separation of church and state, which is nothing less than total independence of civil society from divine law, from the revealed religion, and from the Holy Church. And their first principle, a principle that liberal Catholics always emphasize and put forward, is that force must not be at the service of right, or law at the service of truth. This is the lawlessness of liberalism, which we see all around us today. So according to liberal Catholics, if the government protected the faith, it might run the risk of compromising the church rather than serving her. It's this idea that the church becomes polluted by contact with the secular authorities by becoming too entwined with secular power. The publication of Pope Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors, of course forcefully condemning liberalism, upset nearly all the governments in Europe that were liberal at this time and provoked incidents, anti-Catholic incidents in many places, such as in Naples and Palermo, where they burned copies of the document in the public square. And Bishop Dupanloup responded with his book, the September 15 Convention and the December 8 Encyclical. And this threw a lifeline to which the liberals could cling to avoid permanent shipwreck and remain working within the church. So Bishop Dupanloup interpreted the syllabus using his own famous distinction between the thesis and the hypothesis. Now, this distinction is sometimes legitimate, but it can only be applied with the utmost care. In this case, the thesis is the immutable truth in all its purity. The hypothesis, the thesis's concrete application, takes into account the conditions, the particular conditions of society. At a given moment, the hypothesis can be tolerated as a concession imposed by the facts, but it can never replace the thesis. It is only reluctantly accepted as a lesser evil. Therefore, a Catholic is obliged to work to end the conditions preventing the application of the thesis. Bishop Dupanloup cleverly turned the liberal theses into hypotheses, even though they negated the Catholic theses. The Count Montalembert praised Bishop Dupanloup's work as a masterpiece of eloquent obfuscation. Even though it was weak, the book provided the escape route for the liberals. Altogether a nice piece of hypocrisy. When we know that Bishop Dupanloup kept his liberal attitude all through his career, and that the purpose of the pamphlet was to support the liberals' point of view in the utmost diplomatic terms possible. Nonetheless, the publication of Bishop Dupanloup's work saved so-called Catholic liberalism by allowing it to resurface, as it did years later. Now, there had been previous attempts at a rapprochement, or what became known as a rallying or a ralliement, of the French clergy to the various regimes that obtained in the 19th century in France. Firstly, the French clergy had tried to effect a rapprochement with King Louis Philippe's liberal constitutional monarchy, and then next with the short-lived Second Republic. Archbishop Donnet of Bordeaux wrote, "The flag of the Republic will be a protection for religion." As for Archbishop Aff of Paris, he declared officially to the new government, quote, "It is my pleasure to tell you that you can rely on the loyal help of all the clergy of Paris," end quote. However, the support given by the above-mentioned clergy to Napoleon III's Second Empire brought the rupture of liberal Catholics with the Republicans to a head. We might also say that the lack of political education and, among some, of deep conviction was such that if the vast majority of the Catholics in France were monarchists, many legitimists eventually joined the liberal Orleanists, who favoured a constitutional monarchy rather than monarchy of divine right. And then after some hesitation, a number of them would rally behind the Third Republic at the behest of Rome, as we will see. We must also specify that Pope Pius IX, Pope from 1846 to 1878, was not satisfied with a general condemnation of liberalism. He was quite precise. French Monsignor de Ségur, who lived from 1820 to 1881, quoted a large number of his briefs and addresses specifically condemning so-called Catholic liberalism. Pope Pius IX said, quote, "My dear children, my words must convey what lies deep down in my heart. What afflicts your country and prevents it from deserving God's blessings is confusion in the principles. I will speak the word and not keep it silent. Those I most fear are not all the wretches of the Paris Commune," that is the 1848 revolutionary movement and government in Paris. "They are real demons from hell who prowl on earth. No, what I fear is this unfortunate policy of Catholic liberalism. It is the true scourge. I have said it more than 40 times. I repeat it for the sake of my love for you. Yes, this seesaw game is precisely what might destroy religion. Doubtless we must practice charity and do what we can to bring stray sheep back to the fold. But to achieve this, there is no need to share their opinions. End quote. So Monsignor de Ségur concludes, basically, liberalism is no more Catholic than Protestantism. If you want to remain a liberal, please stop proclaiming yourself a Catholic. Liberalism is but an offshoot of Protestantism. It is the logical offspring of self-examination. Yes, Catholicism and liberalism are absolutely incompatible, and henceforth a Christian with some schooling cannot with a safe conscience be, or claim to be, liberal and Catholic. End quote.
The fall of the Papal States in 1870, when the French garrison was withdrawn by Napoleon III to face the Prussians at the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War, was followed by the French defeat in that war in 1871 and the rise and then fall of the Paris Commune in the revolutionary atmosphere of the fall of Napoleon's regime, which was a shocking moment in which the Archbishop of Paris was murdered by the communards, and there was a fierce outbreak of mob anti-Catholicism in France. The Third Republic was established in 1875 after the failure of the restoration of a compromise monarchy under Henry V, Henri the Comte de Chambord, and the 1880s were a bad decade for the church in France. In 1882, Education Minister and avowed Freemason Jules Ferry had created compulsory secular education, which took away the church control of schools, contrary to the 1801 Concordat, and he also expelled the male religious orders like the Jesuits, stating that he wanted to organize humanity without God and without kings. The newly elected Leo XIII, elected Pope in 1878, was himself fluent in French, had visited Paris before, was attracted to French culture, and was surprisingly muted in response to Ferry's policies, at least for a time in the early 1880s.
With the fall of Napoleon III's Second Empire in 1870, there was a growing atmosphere of so-called anti-clericalism in the French Third Republic. The 1801 Concordat, negotiated by Napoleon with Pius VII, continued to govern the relations of church and state, but there was growing strain on the terms of the Concordat as the Republicans and the liberals gained power in the Third Republic. In 1881, the method of stoppage of salary began to be employed against priests whose political attitude was unsatisfactory to the government. And then the law of 1893, which was actually after the Ralliement of Pope Leo XIII, subjected the financial administration of church property to the same rules as civil establishments. In March of 1888, Leo XIII had written to President Greve, complaining of the anti-religious bitterness and expressing a hope that the eldest daughter of the church would find it possible to abandon this struggle if she would not forfeit that unity and homogeneity among her citizens which had been the source of her own particular greatness, and thus oblige history to proclaim that one inconsiderate day's work had destroyed in France the magnificent achievement of the ages. President Jules Greve replied that the religious feeling complained of was the outcome mainly of the hostile attitude of a section of the clergy to the Republic itself. So there was this pressure from the Republican authorities in France for the Pope to do something to suppress anti-Republican, royalist French Catholics. It's also important to add that the collapse in 1889 of the Boulangist movement, which was a kind of popular nationalist monarchism that had grown up around this General Georges Boulanger, represented the last chance, the last moment where there was enough popular support and military backing to overthrow the French Republican regime. but its failure in 1889 convinced Leo that the French Third Republic was now an established polity. But as a matter of fact,
conciliation was impossible because the anti-clericals within the French Third Republic were not acting in goodwill. They wanted to secularize France, and they were determined to realize their vision.
as Freemasons themselves declared at the convent of the Grand Orient of France, whose emblem you can see in the top right, in 1919, quote, "Beyond governments which do not last, Freemasonry, the structure, the republic, carries on," end quote. And Freemasonry, as we know, well and truly defines itself as the counter-church. We also must bear in mind that Freemasonry has a twofold doctrine. One is exoteric, it's known, that of rationalism and liberalism, which promote the cult of man. The other one is esoteric and secret, namely Gnosis and Satanism for high-ranking Masons. The G in the Masonic triangle stands for Gnosis, knowledge. Of course, they like to conceal the second doctrine, which is in fact a religion, and they publicly proclaim the first, the rationalism and liberalism. Freemason Léon Gambetta, another French politician, stated, quote, "The new National Assembly must stand up and say, 'Here I am still the France of self-examination and free thinking,'" end quote, which is an expression of this first unveiled Masonic doctrine. As for Catholic liberalism or liberal Catholicism, or even what became Christian democracy, they are liable to be toned down or fuzzy versions of the Masonic doctrine devised for the use of Catholics in view of their self-destruction. However, this is not the only means Freemasonry has used against the Church. Freemasonry has also tried to discredit her in the mind of all by means of, for instance, the 18th century encyclopedia by Denis Diderot and many defaming handbills and pamphlets, as well as affairs and scandals which the Lodge has whipped up into a frenzy in the press, such as Marie Antoinette's affair of the diamond necklace, or the Dreyfus affair, which would occur shortly after the Ralliement. They also attacked the Church violently from the outside, using the French Revolution, which ruined Catholic states, the best temporal support of the Church, and by the same occasion confiscated her properties, spoliated monasteries, parishes, hospitals, schools, and universities, as well as all charities. And then eventually in the pontificate of Pius IX, they managed to destroy the Papal States, so that henceforth the papacy was at the mercy of the Rothschilds and other bankers of the same clique. But the worst vector of their anti-Catholic action was that Freemasonry wanted to infiltrate and corrupt the Church from within. We shouldn't be surprised that Masonry infiltrated the Church. Masonry has always used entryism. They are children of darkness, working in the shadows. And already in the 18th century, before the French Revolution, Freemasonry numbered among its members not only diocesan priests, but also monks, and not only subordinates, but leaders, priors, abbots, and bishops. In his encyclical, Inscrutably, Pius VI warned against this, quote, "Freemasons are trying to make their way to the sanctuary," end quote. Etium in sanctuarium insinuat. In 1789, according to Bernard Fay, members of the clergy were at the head of 27 lodges, and many Mason clerics were among the revolution figureheads. The best known of these are, of course, the Abbé Sieyès, the Abbé Grégoire, Oratorian Father Fouché, and, of course, Bishop de Talleyrand of Autun. In 1899, Melanie Calvat, one of the seers of La Salette, wrote, "Is it at all astonishing that Freemasonry gives orders to senators and ministers, since most of them are 33rd degree Masons? Has not France been ruled by this accursed infernal sect for a long time? And think that a number of bishops and priests are members of the poisonous sect," end quote. Then on the following year, she added, quote, "I am only too aware dear Reverend Father, that there are archbishops, bishops, and many priests who are allies of the Freemasons, and it is the second beast of the apocalypse which comes out from the earth on which it feeds." End quote. It is in fact quite disturbing to see that there is some kind of seemingly Masonic lineage within the Secretariat of State in particular, which has always been the Roman government agency closest to the sovereign pontiff. And we can start with some names of clerics associated with the Secretariat of State who have been alleged
to have been
Freemasons. So to start with Cardinal Giacomo Antonelli, who many have claimed was a Freemason, and he advocated for liberal politics with the previous Pope, Pope Pius IX. He encouraged him to give a constitutional form of government to the Papal States in 1848 and became to some extent the Prime Minister of the Pontifical States, which he tried to draw into the Risorgimento War against Austria in support of the Italian national cause, over which the revolutionaries, the Masonic Carbonari, and other Masons were trying to stir trouble. His military fiasco and the population's discontent prompted the Pope to appoint another liberal, Pellegrino Rossi, at the head of his government. But Rossi was murdered 2 months later by liberals who wished to go further and faster. Pius IX then was forced into exile in Gaeta after a revolution breaking out in Rome. Cardinal Antonelli joined him, who then became his Secretary of State. Subsequently, after the restoration of papal rule in Rome, both of them would turn more sharply to conservative politics. Incidentally, Giacomo Antonelli was one of the last non-priest cardinals. He belatedly accepted to be ordained a deacon and made a cardinal. He has been described as, quote, frivolous and religiously indifferent, end quote, and when he died, his important patrimony became the cause of a lawsuit between his putative daughter, the Countess Lambertini, and his own family. Now, it seems strange to think that a pope like Leo XIII, who was so opposed to Masonry, would allow a character like Mariano Rampolla to achieve such prominence in his government. Perhaps Pope Leo's confidence in Rampolla reflected something of the latter's character. He has many of the hallmarks, seemingly, of a wolf in sheep's clothing. So Mariano Rampolla del Tendaro was sent as nuncio to Spain in 1882 by Leo XIII, and his personal secretary was Giacomo della Chiesa, who would go on to become Pope Benedict XV in 1914. In 1887, Leo XIII appointed this brilliant diplomat, Rampolla, as his Secretary of State. And then in 1903, famously, Cardinal Rampolla barely missed out on being elected as Pope instead of St. Pius X. It was only on Monsignor Juin's advice that the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph vetoed him using his jus exclusive, and this veto was brought up in the papal conclave on August 2nd, 1903 by Cardinal Kuzina, Prince Bishop of Krakow, preventing Rampolla's election and paving the way for Pope Pius X's election. Now, Cardinal Mariano Rampolla del Tindaro was appointed only 3 years after the publication of Humanum Genus, Pope Leo XIII's famous encyclical denouncing Freemasonry. And it's been alleged, and we're going to look at some of the evidence here, that Cardinal Rampolla was himself a high-ranking Mason who had been initiated into the Zurich lodge of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO. Now, there's some proof of this which those that accuse Cardinal Rampolla of Freemasonry have brought forward. They claim that there were papers found after his death that showed he was working for the church's enemies and benefited at the same time for the Pope's full confidence. And it was Cardinal Rampolla who was crucial in encouraging the Pope to compel Catholics to accept the Ralliement to the Masonic French Republic under this pretext of converting the French Republic from within. Now, the Ordo Templi Orientis had been founded in 1895 by Karl Kellner, who was an Austrian industrialist in Zurich. And allegedly Theodor Reuss succeeded him after his death and granted national subordinate charters to Rudolf Steiner for Austria, the Steiner schools, in 1906, to a man called Papus for France in 1908, Harvey Spencer Lewis for the United States, and to Alistair Crowley for the British Isles in 1912. And Crowley would subsequently become the head of the Ordo Templi Orientis in 1923, which he would remain until his death in 1947.
With the caveat that we must be careful when assessing Masonic claims which are shrouded in secrecy and grandiloquence.
So Cardinal Mariano Rampolla was alleged to be an Ordo Templi Orientis member. He was Secretary of State for Leo XIII from 1887 to 1903. And he was succeeded by Pietro Gaspari, who is also alleged to have been an Ordo Templi Orientis member and was Cardinal Rampolla's protege. He would become Secretary of State from 1914 to 1930 under Pope Benedict XV and Pope Pius XI. There's also a connection here to Giovanni Battista Montini, who is alleged to have been a member of the Roman Ordo Templis Orientis called the Rampolla Lodge.
We'll look at those claims more in a future presentation.
Who would become, of course, the future Paul VI. He was Cardinal Gaspari's protege and entered the Secretariat of State in 1922. Later, he would become Pope Pius XII's Pro-Secretary of State from 1952 to 1954, when the Resicum scandal was the reason for his discreet expulsion. Then later we have Cardinal Jean Villot, who has been alleged a number of times to have been a Freemason, who was Secretary of State under Paul VI and John Paul II. He was Secretary of State from 1969 to 1979. And he was followed by Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, who again has been alleged to have been a Freemason and was Secretary of State under John Paul II from 1979 to 1990. These critical figures show, and these continuing allegations of Freemasonry in the Secretariat of State, I think, do need serious consideration.
If you think about the point of view from the enemies of the Church, then the part of the Vatican government which you would most prioritize for infiltration and subversion would be that part of the government which interfaces with the city of man, with the unconverted world, in order to shape Vatican policy to be more conciliatory and less confrontational towards that unconverted world. And indeed, what we've seen largely since the Ralliement of Pope Leo XIII, a policy whose architect was this alleged Freemason, Cardinal Rampolla, has been the continued ralliement to the unconverted world.
So to return to Cardinal Rampolla and the allegation that he was a member of the Ordo Templi Orientis, we have two accounts given by Félix Cassus in a French source, Sous la Bonnière, and he brings forward a priest who was quoted by Félix Leconte in his Bloc Anti-Revolutionnaire of June-July 1929. He was told by a bookseller as he was visiting Einsiedeln Abbey in Switzerland that in 1907 the said Cardinal Rampolla was holidaying. The bookseller said, quote, "He is not worth it. Every other week he goes to the Zurich Lodge," end quote. And the other account which is brought forward is taken from a book which was published every 5 years for high-ranking members of the Ordo Templi Orientis, of which it's the official organ. It's called the Equinox, and the quoted issue was published in Detroit, Michigan in 1919. It gives, among the 18 most important subsidiary organizations, the names of the Gnostic Catholic Church, the Order of the Illuminati, the Memphis Rite, the Misraim Rite, the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, the Martinist Order, etc. It also gives the names of some of its most distinguished members, among whom were Wolfgang von Goethe, King Louis II of Bavaria, Richard Wagner, Friedrich Nietzsche, Eliphas Levi, who was formerly a priest, formerly the Abbé Constant, Franz Hartmann, who was Archbishop of Cologne, and the name Cardinal Rampolla. So it's obvious that there was an impressive continuity of this sponsorship in the Secretariat of State, which came with a programme, a consistent policy that was followed, with a few significant differences through the years. And there's a striking continuity in what can be looked at as a school of thought, with differences among the disciples who learnt the job in the Rampolla team as secretaries or proteges of each other. You have Rampolla, later Gaspari della Chiesa, later Benedict XV, Pacelli, later Pius XII, and his collaborator Montini, later Paul VI, as well as Redini Tedeschi and his protege Roncalli, later John the 23rd. And really the only breach of continuity prior to the Second Vatican Council here was the pontificate of St. Pius X from 1903 to 1914. Of course, subsequently, a number of church high dignitaries, particularly in the Secretariat of State, were to join Masonry, allegedly, in the Rampolla Lodge or the infamous Propaganda Due Lodge. The existence of the P2 Lodge was revealed on the occasion of the Banco Ambrosiano affair, when Roberto Calvi, a member of the P2 Lodge, was managing the Banco Ambrosiano, whose main shareholder was the Central Bank of the Vatican, known as the Institute for Works of Religion. Beyond this claimed infiltration, we must also take influence into account. So Benedict XV, Giacomo della Chiesa, had been Gaspari's companion and Rampolla's private secretary before becoming a minutante in 1887 and next a substitute at the Secretariat of State from 1901 to 1907. He later showed a miniature of his former master Rampolla to a French priest and said, quote, "I remain a disciple of Leo XIII and of this man," end quote. On November 25th, 1921, during his pontificate, Benedict XV disbanded the Sodalitium Pianum, also known as La Sapinière in French, which was an organization that had been fighting modernist infiltration with St. Pius X's effective support. Soon after his election, Benedict XV also expressed in a pastoral letter his high esteem for Marc Sanglier, who had been condemned together with Les Sillons, his organization, The Furrow, by his predecessor. And Benedict XV was to resume the Ralliement policy initiated by Leo XIII and Cardinal Rampolla. And allegedly, after Cardinal Rampolla's death, further proof of his affiliation to the Zurich Masonic Lodge of the Ordo Templi Orientis was found among his papers. Again, allegedly, as he was dying, St. Pius X said, quote, "Despite all I did, I could not delay one moment the progress of the sect." So the Cardinal Pecci was elected Pope Leo XIII in
1878.
And the French premier, the Freemason Léon Gambetta, was aware of a kind of ambivalence, reportedly, in Leo XIII. He welcomed his election in a letter dated January the 21st,
1878.
He wrote, quote, "Today is a great day. A new pope has been appointed. He is the elegant and genteel Cardinal Pecci, Bishop of Perugia, from whom Pius IX had tried to take away the tiara by appointing him as Carmelengo. This Italian, who is even more a diplomat than a priest, has escaped from all the intrigues of the Jesuits and exotic clergy. I welcome this promising event. He will not openly break with the traditions and statements of his predecessor, but his behaviour, his acts, and his relationships will be more valuable than any speech. And, if he does not die too soon, we can hope for a marriage of convenience with the church." Then in another letter written the next day, he adds, quote, "He is a hell of an opportunist. Shall we be in a position to deal with him? Chi lo sa, as the Italians say." End quote. So the job of fitting this square peg in a round hole would turn out with the policy of the Ralliement some years later. These two letters of Léon Gambetta are quoted by Monsignor de la Suze, who adds that, on the other hand, this shows that Leo XIII was an anti-liberal.
In theory, if not always in practice.
Back in 1849, under the pontificate of Pius IX, at the Provincial Council of Spoleto, Pecci had proposed the sovereign pontiff give a constitution enumerating the errors concerning the church authority and property. And this suggestion may well have been the origin of Pius IX's syllabus. So this is not to impugn Leo XIII's orthodoxy.